I got into decision research when I did a Master's of Business Administration, MBA, in the late 60s. And I suddenly had this idea, when I was doing my MBA, that one thing that was missing in the whole story was how did you to marry together the psychology of decision-making with statistical decision theory. And it suddenly occurred to me a really big and important problem was how do people make decisions, and could you help people make better decisions? And so I formulated that idea very early, about when I was about 25 or 26 years old. And after that I was clear, I just went down that path. Okay. So it was actually, in retrospect now, it was actually very simple. I had this idea. It's also true, I had worked in companies for 6 or 7 years before I did my MBA, so I had some business experience. And I had gone around companies as an auditor, seeing various things, and I noticed how many bad decisions companies made. And so I realized that making decisions was a really key thing, and it just seemed to me a nice thing, interesting thing to do. And at that time, no one was doing it. So it actually made it more challenging, I think, to think how you could do it. And then I was lucky. When I did my PhD, I found someone who was interested in doing the same, who was doing the same thing. It was Hillel Einhorn, who was my thesis advisor and subsequently one of my best friends. I worked with him afterwards as a colleague. He was only a year older than I was. And so basically, he wasn't an established person, but I didn't know that. I was naive, I was naive about the way the world worked. And I just, oh, he's a professor, that's fine for me. And I just followed. It wasn't very, very well thought through on my part, but it wasn't strategic. It was just that I thought this was the best guy to work with, so I worked with him. In the academic world, I think the role models are very important because you learn more than just the substantive knowledge. You learn how to conduct yourself in professional relationships. You learn yourself how to write, how to do the kinds of things that are important, which you can only learn as a craft. It's like doing an apprenticeship, where basically you have a master and someone following, and you're learning the craft of doing it. So it's actually very important. A good decision? Well, first of all, I think the good decision should be judged not just by what happens, the outcome, but should be judged by the process, how the person went through the process of actually making the decision. Did the person evaluate all the alternatives? Did the person think about what was uncertain and what was unlikely? Did the person use their imagination to imagine alternative futures? All these kinds of things bundled together make a good decision. To make good decisions, you have to have a good grasp of what the problem is. So basically understanding the parameters of the problem, the environment you're in, what are the options. Second is you need a lot of imagination. Imagination to imagine what could happen in the future, and imagination, because I don't think you can assess the probabilities or assess the uncertainty unless you've got good imagination. So I think basically problem definition and imagination. That's only two things, but I think that's the most important. And then in problem definition, I would include knowing exactly what's at issue, the right stakes, what's involved, and defining well what the situation is. So there's a definition of the problem and imagination. Okay. It's not. I'm not saying I say imagination. I'm not saying dreaming out of this world, but imagination is important. And it could be a little bit of dreaming, but basically imagination of what could be, how it could be, what could happen. There are techniques you can use also. For example, imagine yourself in the future. Your decision has already been taken, turned out well. How did that happen? You're in the future, the decision turned out badly. How did that happen? And that helps you to sort of think through what all the steps are and how to make things happen. And that, I think, can be trained. You can train people to do that. The decisions that are difficult are when there are good outcomes. And when people have got, I remember the story of one of my students who got 2 very good job offers after graduating and getting his PhD. And he went into a complete mess for about 2 months because he couldn't make up his mind between the two. In fact, it didn't matter because basically both were very good outcomes. And so that was kind of interesting to me, was that the very good outcomes caused lots of problems. If you had 2 bad outcomes, you probably wouldn't have had such problems. I think decisions are hard when they involve trade-offs. A lot of the time, people are trying to structure problems so they don't have to face a trade-off. But every now and then you face a situation where you really have a trade-off, like, for example, money against health, health risk, things like that. So anything involving a trade-off, I think, is very hard. I think most of the time we make our own decisions without actually facing trade-offs. So when there is a trade-off, Even though economics always assumed we handle trade-offs, I think psychological trade-offs are very hard. For example, the student I talked about and the two jobs, he was trading off essentially what the advantages of one versus the advantages of the other. And what was very difficult for him was actually to figure out how those two traded off. I don't think there's a simple strategy to deal with, to really deal with trade-offs. The only thing is unless you restructure the problem so there is no trade-off, which people sometimes do, or fool themselves into thinking that there is no trade-off. But I don't think there's a free lunch there. There may be other situations where you can actually make decisions with heuristics and things which help. Don't have to face a trade-off. But I think sometimes, occasionally, you have to face a trade-off. We're pretty good at making decisions when there's already been narrowed down for us to 3 or 4 options. But if there are like 20 options, which can vary and become more complicated, then it becomes more difficult. For example, one of the decisions I find extraordinarily difficult, so I'm not dealing with very, very badly right now, is when to buy a new car. I have an old car, not so old, 9 years old, but I know in a couple of years' time I must definitely change it. But actually figuring out what car I'm going to buy is actually a very daunting prospect. There's too many options available. Right now we're in a situation where we're getting into what's called this big data era, which means basically associated with anything we do, there's just a whole bunch of data you can get. And how do you find the right information is not clear. I think one of the interesting things right nowadays, which is interesting and related to that, is medical advice. People go to the computer a lot to get medical advice. And you find that if you go to the medical advice, you get 25 different symptoms, which you never even heard of, and both negative and positive, and it's just very confusing. Some colleagues and I wrote a book a few years back, and we distinguished between 2 kinds of uncertainty. One we call coconut uncertainty, I'll explain in a moment, and the other we called subway uncertainty. Subway uncertainty is the uncertainty you face every day, which you know. So, for example, what is the probability of getting to work on time? If you go to, imagine you go to work by subway. What's the probability of arriving at work on time? Well, over 100 days, you get a good idea of the distribution of probabilities of arriving late at work or not. Coconut uncertainty concerned a story, an apocryphal story, I'm glad to say, of a poor man who went to the South Sea Islands. He was very risk-averse, and he went out in the morning, and he sat underneath a coconut tree thinking of all his money in the world, and all of a sudden a coconut dropped from this coconut on the top of the tree, fell down on his head and killed him. We call that coconut uncertainty. He couldn't have guessed that was going to happen. No one could have guessed that was going to happen, but coconuts do arrive, and you can't do anything about it. So basically you have to, no point even trying to estimate those coconuts. But what you can do is just not sit under trees and things like that, which could help you to get out of the way of them. There are lots of different types of coconuts that could occur. And that's why we just call this one the coconut uncertainty. But the subway uncertainty you can guess, because you've got a historical record, and with a historical record, and you know that the world's not going to change very much in that respect. You can rely on the uncertainty there. You can quantify it. But I think what's really important is to know the difference between the uncertainties that you can quantify and those that you can't quantify. And the mistake is to think you can quantify the unquantifiable. I think my view on uncertainty, the difference, for example, between coconut uncertainty and subway uncertainty, is just an accumulation of experience over the years of actually literature, reading about uncertainty, reading about risk, researching risk, and at the same time, you can't actually eliminate entirely your own personal experience from things. That happens all the time. Particularly with risk. I mean, for example, we all face risks every day. We face risks walking down the stairs. We face risk eating a meal in a restaurant all the time. We have some kinds of risk we're facing. And that must affect you. And if you're a decision researcher, obviously you pay more attention in some sense to the structure of those kinds of situations. There are situations where you can't judge what the uncertainty is going to be. You can't calculate the uncertainty. What you must look at is look for actions you can take that could help you in case something happens. Take earthquakes, for example. There's no way we can predict the precise moment an earthquake is going to take place. We know roughly where they're going to take place, but we can't predict the precise moment, day, time, or whatever. On the other hand, we can build buildings in certain ways so that if an earthquake hits, it will be less hurt. We can do other kinds of protective measures. So I would say the way you should handle those kinds of events is by trying to build protective measures. Now, you can't, unfortunately, do all the protective measures. It's just too expensive. But doing some simpler things can be very helpful. So, for example, If you take the recent earthquakes in Nepal, which have been devastating, why have they been devastating? Well, they've been devastating because of the earthquakes, but also because of the way the buildings were built. The buildings were very, very, very poor and not well structured, and because of that, that caused many more deaths. So I think they can't predict that when the next earthquake is going to strike, but at least you could do is invest in having stronger or earthquake-proof type buildings. I mean, and you could apply that metaphor to other kinds of situations involving, for example, banks and risk. If you're going to involve in the risky strategies of a bank, you should have enough reserves to be able to handle it. And most of the surprising decision strategies I know are silly ones, where people do things just at random, more or less. So I think that what would be most surprising to me is a random decision strategy. One of my favorite stories concerns the Spanish national lottery. I don't know if you know the story, but every year in Spain at Christmas time there's a big lottery, statewide lottery, and it's a huge lottery. And one year, a poor little peasant wins the lottery. And the TV cameras come down to the little village where he is, and they say to him, "How come you won the lottery?" And he says, "Well, I had the strategy." They said, "What? What was your strategy?" "I looked for a ticket ended in the digits 4 and 8, because you're allowed to have different numbers on the tickets. So you look for a ticket had 4 and 8? Yes, I wanted a ticket with 4 and 8. Why? Well, you see, I dreamt of the number 7. I dreamt of the number 7 7 nights in a row, and 7 times 7 makes 48. So basically, this was a totally irrational strategy, right? But on the other hand, he turned out to win the lottery. Emotions are part of decision-making, your decision-making system. I think emotions are basically, in some sense, emotions can be thought of as animal instincts, which we have, which allow us to actually maneuver around in the world. Well, basically, your emotion is accessing information which you may not be normally accessing. You're responding to things with signals without realizing why you're responding to them at first, and then after a while you've got the signal, you then have to interpret the signal. This guy came for a job interview at the university, and he was interviewed, and he went into his office, and everybody who met him said, "This guy is terrific," because basically his curriculum vitae is wonderful, his papers are terrific, etc. And when there was a meeting to discuss the case, one person got up and said, "Look, this guy is terrific in the sense of his curriculum vitae is good, everything, but when I met with him, I had a funny feeling there was something fishy, something wrong." And all of a sudden, the guy was very honest. He said, "Look, this is an emotional thing I had. I just put it on the table. I had a funny feeling." And then he suddenly found that around the room, several other people said exactly the same thing. They'd all had a funny feeling as well. So basically, I thought that was very good, because basically what had happened there was they had emotions, and they treated the emotions as data for the decision-making process. So I think what I would argue is you can use emotions as part of the data in which you make a decision. Just the fact you can't make it explicit doesn't mean it's not real. I think the animal decision-making, I think, was put in more of an evolutionary perspective. That basically the animals that have survived today are ones that have survived evolution up to this point in time. So on average, they're probably making fairly good decisions, at least as a species, not necessarily as each individual animal. So I'm not surprised animals have been shown to be quite successful, because otherwise if they weren't successful, presumably they would be wiped out up to a point, or at least considerably hurt. It's surprising sometimes animals are as accurate as they are, because they use very simple processes. But so it's interesting to see how animals manage to do these things with very simple processes. Animals are very, very good, we know, at responding to frequency information. The number of times something happens are very, very sensitive too, and that's very good for them. In the same way humans are actually very good at that too. So some of the aspects of which humans are good at making decisions are also shared with animals, and presumably that's because they have a long evolutionary kind of history. Well, I think in almost most of the dimensions in life, it pays to get important decisions. It pays to get others' opinions. The question is what you do with other people's opinions. And the evidence suggests that actually most people don't actually weigh the opinions of others as much as they should. So basically, one way of thinking about it is that if I have a decision to take, and you're a person who is similar to me, if I could ask your opinion, what I should do is actually weigh your opinion about almost as similar as mine. I shouldn't overweight my opinion relative to your opinion. I should give you more weight. And the general finding in the literature is that people don't give enough weight to the opinions of others when taking advice. So when you're taking advice, you must also realize that sometimes the advice you get will not be what you want to hear, but you've got to take that into account. If I was going to make a decision on some important issue, I'd like to find someone who's been in the same situation or can relate to it. If I took a total stranger who has nothing to do, knows nothing about the situation whatsoever, I don't want to consider that person's opinion because I don't think they're as clear as. So I would like someone who has some expertise in what we're talking about. I think that the trouble with groups is not knowing what the information other people have, and allowing everybody to be able to have to put the information on the table, and to hold back your own opinion until you've heard other people. And so I think what's really important in group is actually the structure of the agenda of the way the meeting is structured. And I think the structure of the group, the way that information is exchanged, and those kinds of things can be extraordinarily important. Well, you don't get that quite at the individual level. So basically, if I go into a meeting in a group, I should not be telling people what I think. I should just be picking up facts from others, giving my facts to them, and so on and so forth. And eventually let the group get together and get all the information out onto the table, and then come to some kind of decision. I mean, that's a bit different from what you do as an individual. At the beginning, there should be no holes barred, in the sense that basically people should be able to say things that are both for and against different alternatives without any agendas. And I think if you do that, try and make that as neutral as possible, that can help the group come to an opinion. And I think the worst thing in a group is to force people is voting, starting off by voting straight away. Because then people are put into corners. And you want to dissociate at the beginning, giving arguments and countering arguments from voting. And the voting should only come at the end when you've got all the information out on the table. Even if voting is used, that is. There are also different kinds of problems sometimes. Sometimes a problem is such that when you get a solution, everybody sees a solution. And other problems are more vague in the sense like you're trying to predict what's going to happen in the future. You can't necessarily predict. But for example, solving some kind of an administrative problem, maybe one person in the group comes up with a tremendous idea. And as soon as that idea is on the table, everyone sees immediately that's the right solution to go. So that's another distinction. The type of problem makes a difference in group decision making. I think we have to realize that machines can do things better than humans in some things and not other things. What machines can do is actually aggregate information consistently in ways that humans can't. So if you can break up the decision problem into a part that the human actually decides what the decision is, perhaps measures some things with it, sees things the machines can't machine, and then give over the calculation to the machine, that's the way to go. I'll give you a very concrete example. Think of buying things in a supermarket. When we buy things in the supermarket, we look and see what the prices are, and we put them in the chariot. Then we go to the checkout counter. What do we do at the checkout counter? We trust everything to a machine, right? We put the thing. The woman swipes it, and basically we trust the machine because basically we know we've been able to read what the product is. It's the product we want, and we trust the machine is going to actually aggregate the information correctly. We don't question the addition on the bill. I've never yet seen anybody at a supermarket questioning the addition on the bill. Mm. And I think that can be that sort of metaphor could be applied to lots of decisions we take. So, for example, I'm in charge of admitting PhD students at my university and in our department. And what we do, or what I do, is I rely on rules. I have a little algorithm which I apply to the candidates. Now, I don't necessarily follow them 100%, but I follow them a good deal of the percentage of the time because I know that basically that my rule will add up the information more accurately than I can. And therefore, I should trust the rule more than me. It's only when there's a big disagreement that I sort of go into it and wonder what's going on, why didn't I get the same result I expected, and so on and so forth. And I think that's an important principle. So I think in the long term, we will learn better when to trust machines and when to trust humans. At the moment, I think we either don't trust them at all, and we think we can somehow or other out-predict them, or it's the reverse. You can go the other way. So I think you have to get a balance. But I think there's no question in my mind that the function, that just in the same way at the supermarket, the bills are now being added up by the machines. That's going to happen to lots of other tasks. I mean, for example, nowadays, almost nobody checks their bank balance in the sense of adding everything up. In my generation and the generation before, we used to actually calculate every time we took out a check exactly what difference it made, everything. So, but now with the machines there, they do it for us, because we don't need to waste our time on actually adding up, because they're so reliable. Sometimes it depends whether you get me on a good day or a bad day. On a good day, I say, yes, we've advanced a lot. On a bad day, I say, we haven't advanced at all. I think it depends. I think sometimes, every now and then, I've actually gone back every now and then and read some of my old papers, and I'm surprised at how good and how stupid I was at the same time. Because sometimes I find in the old papers some very good things, but also some very, very, very stupid things. And so I think, on average, the field, I believe the field has advanced, but it's more of a belief than a total conviction. I know for sure, and it will change even more, is actually methodology and equipment for doing methodology. I'll give you an example of that. When I started out, people used to do eye tracking. The eye tracking machines were very difficult to use. People were sort of strapped down into machines which looked like dentist chairs. People who had glasses were not eligible for these subjects and things. And basically, eye tracking was a very, very difficult, heavy task. Nowadays, it's quite sophisticated. And I imagine in about 30, 40 years' time, people will have implanted chips in their system, which will do all the eye tracking for us without a thing. So I think what's going to happen over the next few years is the technology is going to help us to collect data in ways which we haven't done so far. And that's going to make a big difference. So what's going to have to happen is we're going to have to develop methods for being able to treat all this data. Boy, well, first of all, I think I'd say to them, what's really important is to understand what your objectives are, and actually prioritize your objectives. Second, imagine who you will be in the future. What kind of person you will be. How would you like to be if you could describe yourself in the future, how would you describe yourself? And third, when you come to make any decision, evaluate all the alternatives carefully, and also use your imagination to see which are more likely and which are less likely.